Dr. Perry, I'm going to ask you to look, still on the topic of self-sufficiency, at a short passage from one of your Penrose statements, PRSE 0003755. If we go to the very bottom of the page, we can see it says, at this time, so this is the last two lines, self-sufficiency was an accepted goal for Scotland, which dominated its planning throughout the 1980s. It was also accepted that prescribing doctors were free to exercise their own judgment in the choice of either SNBTS or commercial products, preserving the important principle of clinical freedom. Therefore, whilst SNBTS and haemophilia directors collectively embraced the goal of self-sufficiency, the use of NHS products was not and could not be enforced by SNBTS. Now, would we just leave that on screen, please, Sally? You also elsewhere, in your Penrose oral evidence, I think, referred to the principle of clinical freedom as being quite a sacred principle at the time. The reference for that, we don't need to go to it, is PRSE 306025, pages 1 to 2. When you say here it was accepted that doctors were free to exercise their own judgment, preserving the important principle of clinical freedom, accepted by whom?
I think it was accepted by the Scottish Home and Health Department and the medical staff inside that. It was accepted by SNBTS colleagues, certainly medical colleagues who understood the importance of this principle, and I think they certainly internalised that as an important principle. I think in the case of Professor Cash, I think his view was always that we needed. He had no authority to impose SNBTS products on doctors and so on. So his approach was always one of persuasion, perhaps slightly bordering on coercion occasionally, but that was in the spirit of not exposing patients to commercial products when SNBTS products are available. So yes, it was I think from my perspective, I didn't deal with patients directly for reasons that are perhaps self-evident. But he certainly took the view that he would try and do everything he could to enable prescribing doctors to avoid the use of commercial products, and to do that, the products that SNBTS provided had to be of a quality and specification that would be considered the product of choice by SNBTS doctors, including the fact that they were derived from voluntary non-remunerated donors, which at this time was still an important safety parameter.
And do you know what, if any, particular steps were taken, whether by Dr. Cash or by SNBTS or specifically by the PFC, to try and persuade, influence clinicians to use SNBTS products rather than commercial products?
I think there was a regular process, at least once a year, where the prescribing doctors, the haemophilia directors and the SNBTS directors, including the PFC directors and SHHD officials, which was the annual meeting of directors. And I think Professor Cash and myself always sought to influence or just illuminate the availability of SNBTS products and just to make sure that they absolutely understood what was available from SNBTS, and that in the absence of any good clinical reason, and they took the view that these products should be preferred over commercial products. But it wasn't a position that was forced on haemophilia directors. They would have taken part in those discussions. There might have been discussions about their need for commercial purchase, but that was the forum, the regular forum in which I think that the whole idea and concept of self-sufficiency was born. But they collectively, I think, going back to even to the 1970s, haemophilia doctors and SNBTS directors and the SHHD had collectively in a sense, signed up to the concept of self-sufficiency. I think even as early as the 1970s, they understood the benefits of that in terms of product safety, and I think largely were supportive of the actions and the efforts that that SMBTS was making.
And did you ever get reported back to you, and I'm really thinking here of the first half of the 1980s, any particular concerns being expressed by haemophilia clinicians about the nature or quality of PFC products, reasons why they were using commercial products in place of SMBTS products?
Yeah, there was. We occasionally got reports. I think there were issues certainly in the early 80s about product solubility and convenience. I think it was a larger dose volume than commercial products, and I think there may have even been a preference expressed by some patients that this was a more convenient product. It dissolved more quickly. It was a lower infusion volume, and they could do their home therapy much more conveniently with commercial products. But set against that was it was more than a perceived risk. It was a known risk as far as the SMBTS was concerned, that these products were less safe than SMBTS products.
We can take that down now, thank you, Sally. Do you recall it being drawn to your attention or coming to your attention that at York Hill Hospital there was significant use of commercial concentrates?
Yes, I did know that. I don't know when I knew it or where the information came from, but I was aware that there was a significant use of commercial factor concentrates in York Hill. I don't know the reasons for that, and certainly that changed quite abruptly when I think it was Dr. Gibson became the paediatric haemophilia director for York Hill and the paediatric service in general for haemophilia.
Do you know, and I appreciate you probably can't speak to the time before you joined PFC, but do you know whether there was any contact made by the PFC or more broadly by SNBTS or Dr. Cash with the Dr. Willoughby at York Hill to explore why there was this very significant use for children of commercial concentrates?
I don't know. Is the honest answer. I think one of the problems SMBTS had certainly during the 1980s and perhaps through the 1980s, we didn't have a clear understanding of the pattern of usage throughout Scotland. We knew what was being used of SMBTS products, but we didn't have any regular data from either individual hospitals or haemophilia centres on their use of non-SMBTS products.
Would you have expected someone to be gathering that data, not necessarily PFC, because PFC essentially is a producer of its own products, but someone, again, SNBTS or SHHD, to be, in order to achieve self-sufficiency, to overcome the obstacle created by the sacred principle of clinical freedom, to find out what commercial concentrates were being used and why, so that there could be a systematic approach to reducing that usage?
I think Professor Cash made efforts to understand the pattern of usage in Scotland and to understand the reasons why non-SMBTS products were being used in certain circumstances. I'm not sure that SHHD took any specific action. I suppose, in a sense, from my perspective, they could have done. And indeed, the annual meeting of SMBTS directors and haemophilia directors could have collectively agreed to undertake that analysis. And I think these data did slowly begin to emerge, and maybe the overriding organisation, the umbrella organisation, the UK HCDO organisation, was in a position, and I believe did collect certain data on the use of NHS products and commercial products, but it didn't break it down into individual hospitals or individual prescribing doctors.
Yes, it might be said in relation to the latter organisation, and you're right, they might be well placed to know what was being used. but they're the very clinicians who might be jealously guarding the principle of clinical freedom.
Yes, but they wouldn't necessarily jealously guard the information. I think they were collectively signed up to openness and transparency, and I've no reason to believe that individual haemophilia directors withheld information or certainly falsified information for that purpose. I think I've no reason to believe that was the case. So there were efforts. It took some time to better understand the use of commercial, the reason for commercial products, but the use of commercial product, other than in very few and perhaps rare circumstances, I was never aware of what particular circumstances it would be appropriate to use a commercial product. But by 1983, 1984, the use of commercial product had all but disappeared, I think, as a result of the collective efforts of both haemophilia doctors and SMBTS staff to address that particular issue.
Did Scotland achieve self-sufficiency, in your view, in the 1980s? And if so, approximately when would you say that was achieved?
I think it was probably achieved in 1983, early 1984. And I think it depends how you define self-sufficiency, of course, and I think that was sustained until perhaps 1987, 1988, when I think the organisation faced the sort of collective headwinds of increased demand, loss of yield as a result of introduction of heat treatment and virus inactivation procedures, and I think in 1988 there was a requirement for some commercial purchase. That was a big disappointment.
To what do you attribute Scotland achieving self-sufficiency by late 83, early 84?
I think I alluded this morning to the fact that it set out fairly early on the road to eliminating the use of whole blood transfusions, and therefore being able to collect the plasma which could be used for fractionation. And that process began in the 1970s and certainly progressed in the 1980s. And by 1983, 84, I think whole blood was very seldom used in transfusion in Scotland, which inevitably meant that there was more plasma available for fractionation, which could increase the output from PFC. The other factor was the work undertaken by Dr. Foster to improve process yields at PFC with the introduction of his fairly unique technology for the continuous thawing of plasma, and that yielded very substantial increases in product yield at that time.
Did the pro rata system, as operated in Scotland, have any particular role to play?
I think it was originally designed, if my understanding is correct, the pro rata system was based on the pro rata supply of products in proportion to the amount of plasma that a particular region supplied. There might have been a population bias in that as well, but I think it was primarily introduced to incentivize regions to increase their plasma output, because that meant that the regions in which they operated and their health and respective health authorities would have had reduced costs associated with commercial purchase. So I think it was done to incentivize plasma collection and to provide some basis for an equitable supply of product.
Now, in terms of the PFC's ability to fractionate plasma collected other than in Scotland or Northern Ireland, so plasma from England and Wales, what's your understanding of why that did not happen?
In England and Wales?
So why the PFC was not used to fractionate plasma collected in England and Wales?
In all honesty, I don't think I know the answer to that question. We certainly took the view that we could and perhaps should have done. I'm not familiar with the timeline in England and Wales in terms of the availability of plasma or the capacity at BPL or their building programs. It may well have been that the plasma simply wasn't available. It could have been a plasma shortage, in which case the fact that PFC had capacity to process more wouldn't have actually improved matters in England. But I think from my perspective, certainly when I took over as director, it was always my view that had we been approached to process plasma, then we would have done our utmost to adjust our activities and our processes and procedures to accommodate that.
And had you had any involvement with the, or any direct knowledge of the shift working trial in late 1981?
Yes, I was in post then, and I was involved in it from a quality perspective, because at that stage I was responsible for all issues associated with quality. So I had an overview from a quality perspective on the process. So yes, it was undertaken, as I recall, from basically outdated plasma. It wasn't fresh plasma, and I think its primary purpose, was to establish the capacity of the PFC's central processing system, that's the CSVM, to operate continuously and to demonstrably be able to process more plasma than it could. And I think it achieved that objective. I think it proved over the 2 or 3 week experiment that was undertaken that it could do that. But it didn't encompass all the downstream processing associated with albumin or immunoglobulin, and certainly not coagulation factors, because they weren't prepared from that plasma. So it was a partial success in that sense. I don't think it proved the ability of the PFC to instantly process all the plasma to finished product, but it demonstrated that its core technology was capable of doing more than it did, certainly with shift working.
And did you have any involvement or direct knowledge of any of the discussions relating to shift working or funding that might need to be made available to enable PFC to fractionate English or Welsh plasma?
Not in the early 80s, but when I took over as director, that was still an ongoing, yes, I will call it a fight. It was an ongoing fight to get recognition and understanding that the PFC was fairly unique in the health, not special, but it was fairly unique in the health service, and it needed alternative arrangements for paying its staff in ways which we could put in place a shift working process. So and that was necessary not only for coagulation factors, but for all the other products as well, that we were constrained by the 8-hour day.
And was that a fight with the SHHD or the CSA? Who was the impediment to progress in that respect?
I think it was the Whitley Council. But to answer your question more directly, I think it was an inability between the CSA and the Scottish Home and Health Department to recognise this requirement and make what was seen as a fairly substantial variation order to the Whitley Council, because that's how these things were done. If you wanted to employ somebody, and we had to do this routinely, if you wanted to employ somebody that didn't meet the criteria for a medical laboratory scientific officer, then you had to apply for a variation order. And they sometimes took some time. So it was, in a sense, it was a failure of CSA and SHHD to collectively, in my view, to provide a solution to that. That changed in the early 1990s. I think it was one of the initial projects that Mr. McIntosh engaged on, and we did succeed eventually in getting a bespoke collection of systems for remunerating staff and paying shift premiums and so on. But it took 10 years.
It might be said that the failure to use PFC's fractionating capacity more fully, so as to fractionate plasma from England and Wales, was a lost opportunity for the UK as a whole. Would you agree with that?
I think from my perspective, yes, it was. Yes, I think others might disagree and say the correct solution was the solution we had then, which was rebuild BPL for the whole of England and Wales. But I think, and I think a joint approach to providing the capacity for fractionating products for the UK would have been more quickly met and more efficiently met by a joint approach. And I think it would have been more secure as well. As it was, BPL were processing at least 90% of the plasma for the UK, and the PFC was only producing 10%. Now, in any sensible organisation, you wouldn't have that imbalance. You'd say, in order to secure the long-term security of supply, or at least a minimum level, something closer to a 50-50 split would be appropriate.
In relation to Northern Ireland, your arrival in 1981 essentially coincided with the introduction of the arrangement with Northern Ireland for the fractionation of plasma collected in Northern Ireland. Do you know why it wasn't something that was undertaken earlier? Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, my understanding is that Northern Ireland had some of their plasma processed, but it was mostly outdated plasma by BPL, and they presumably got some. And I'm not sure what the transfer arrangement, whether it was a cross-charging arrangement or a contract fractionation arrangement, but I don't know. I think it came as a result of the culmination of discussions about UK capacity and the final decision that BPL would be redesigned and rebuilt to process for England and Wales, and Scotland would manage the interests and the needs of Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Now, I think you were involved in the quality audit that was undertaken in advance of the plasma actually beginning to be shipped and fractionated to PFC. Yes. But in broad terms, what did that entail?
I think it was an arrangement where both myself and I recall Dr. Cuthbertson were basically went to Northern Ireland Centre. I can't remember how long we spent there, but we did a basic audit of their facilities for the collection, the separation of plasma, their environmental conditions and so on, but importantly their testing arrangements, their arrangements for virological testing of the plasma. And I think, as has been recorded, there was a problem with that initially with the sensitivity of their hepatitis B assay. So plasma didn't come to PFC until that matter was resolved. But thereafter, I think there were subsequent audits of the Northern Ireland Centre by PFC, as well as the Scottish centres.
If we could look at your witness statement to the inquiry, WITN 6920001, please. And if we go to page 55, please, Sally, bottom of the page. So just picking it up at the very bottom of the page, you refer to information about product usage being submitted to the Penrose inquiry. You then say this: these details do not include products used in, top of the next page, Northern Ireland, for which no information was sought or presented. To the best of my knowledge, there was no information held by SNBTS on the breakdown of product use in Northern Ireland, except for the understanding and knowledge from conversations with Dr. Maurice McClelland, Northern Ireland BTS, that supplies of PFC products were insufficient for all patient needs and accordingly were supplemented with commercial product usage. Do you know why it was the case that the amount of PFC product going to Northern Ireland was insufficient, and thus there was still a lot of commercial concentrate being used in Northern Ireland?
Yes, it's quite simple. They didn't provide enough plasma for us to be able to reward them with an increased level of product. The product they got from PFC was in direct proportion to the amount of plasma that they supplied.
So it was a feature of the pro rata system,
and that remained in place for Northern Ireland because they were separately funded. They came under a different jurisdiction, and so it was always the case, even after I dismantled the pro rata system, that Northern Ireland would only get back products as a proportion of the amount of in direct relation to the amount of plasma that was supplied.
And do you know, and it may be that if this is not something that you'd have expected to have knowledge of, but do you know whether issues about that were ever raised on behalf of Northern Ireland with SNBTS or SHHD or the CSA to see whether there was a way in which Northern Ireland could receive a greater quantity of PFC product?
I don't think there was. I think there was certainly Dr. McClelland, Dr. Maurice McClelland, who regularly attended our meetings, understood the arrangements that were in place, and in a sense he knew what needed to be done if he wanted to increase the supply of NHS products for haemophilia patients in Northern Ireland. I guess in 1984, when we did decant what we considered to be excess factor VIII to England and Wales, it would have been possible, maybe we did this, to have supplied additional quantities to Northern Ireland as well.
Can I then ask you next, in broad terms, about pool sizes? We can take that down, thank you, Sally. I don't think I need trouble you with looking at what the data is in relation to each individual year. It's captured in a number of documents. It's captured in documents for the Penrose inquiry, and you'll know this inquiry has attempted to capture it in its own presentation reports. Broadly speaking, it's right, isn't it, that there was an upward trajectory in terms of increase in pool sizes?
There was, yes.
I think the figure Dr. Foster gave, the Penrose inquiry, which was I think somewhere in your evidence also you endorsed, was around 4,000 donations. That
was certainly during the later 1980s. I think it went up to about 900 to 1,000 litres or kilograms of plasma, which would have equated to 4,000 donations roughly. How were decisions taken at PFC and by whom were they taken to increase pool sizes? They would have been primarily taken as a result of discussions between manufacturing managers, the PFC director, probably would involve Dr. Foster as well if there were issues associated with scaling up and so on. He would have been an important, have an important input into those decisions. But I think also in our regular both formal and informal briefings with Professor Cash, he would have been aware of the kind of pool sizes that were being used. But they were the requirement to increase pool sizes, I think, as I mentioned in my witness statement, was driven by the need to increase capacity. And you could either do that by increasing the number of batches that you made, which wasn't immediately accessible to us. You need more freeze dryers, a different configuration of manufacturing facilities, or you simply increase the batch size. And I think we felt that the increase in batch size, it wasn't taken unilaterally. It was taken after discussion, was justified, because even with our increased batch size up to 4,000 donations, that was still substantially less, certainly than commercial producers were using, and certainly substantially less than the pool sizes used by BPL. But then BPL were dealing with more plasma, so that's not a criticism of BPL. It's simply a reality associated with the scale of manufacture.
I think the way you put it at one point on your witness statement is not increasing pool sizes would have exposed patients to greater risks. Now, am I right in understanding that's on the assumption that the alternative then for those patients is the use of commercial concentrates?
If we hadn't increased pool size to increase our manufacturing capacity, then we wouldn't have kept pace with demand, and the only alternative then would have been for haemophilia directors to buy commercial product, which would have been the worst of all outcomes. But I have thought about this some more since the 1980s, and reduced pool size. The pool size is an important parameter. There's no question of that. But it's mostly important when you only have a single use or occasional use of a product. For those patients who are on lifelong therapy using factor VIII, simply keeping small pool sizes would mean that those same patients would be subject to the same amount of donors, because the individual batches wouldn't last as long. So you don't necessarily, in the long term, get a reduced exposure to patients over a period of a year or a lifelong treatment for haemophilia. So it would only be a transient benefit, certainly as far as non-A, non-B hepatitis is concerned. And I think that was our thinking as well. Although pool size was important, smaller batches certainly constrained capacity, but didn't necessarily, in terms of chronic exposure to factor concentrates, necessarily reduce the overall donor exposure over a significant period of time.
One question I've been asked to ask you in relation to factor IX production is whether smaller pools could have been used to prepare factor IX due to the fact that far less was required by way of factor IX concentrates.
Yes, but I think the same principles apply to factor IX as they do to factor VIII. Although it was a lower output product, it did consume manufacturing capacity at PFC. So had we increased the pool size or decreased the pool size for factor IX, or kept it at a very low level, that would have consumed our freeze-drying capacity and our downstream processing capacity, which would have limited our ability to make factor VIII. So both factor VIII and factor IX, which drew upon freeze-drying resources, were interlinked, as it were.
Is it right to understand, if one's looking at it at a much bigger picture, what you're talking about is the decisions that were made constrained by PFC as it was, with the capacity, the size, the number of freeze dryers, the storage facilities, the production lines, the staff it had, rather than it not being possible to devise a system whereby smaller pools could be used?
I think had the plasma supply continued to increase in the way that we wanted it to increase, and indeed it did increase, and we hadn't increased the pool size, then we would have had to have completely reconfigured the manufacturing activities at PFC. It would have become effectively not a large scale, but a small scale manufacturing unit with multiple process streams going on simultaneously, and it's highly expensive, it's highly inefficient. Also, the smaller the pool size, there's a thing called a line loss during the manufacturing process. As you go from one step to another, you always lose some material because it's residues in tanks and so on. And QC sampling, the size of product loss through QC sampling, for example, can start to become very, very substantial. The smaller the pool size become, you could be losing 10 or 20% of your batch just through QC sampling, because the number of samples that you need to take for QC testing is fixed. So, and these become, when you put them all together, they become very substantial losses in output.
Can I just ask you to look at one letter? It's from Dr. Cash to you, just to see if you can help us understand what he was referring to. It's PRSE 0003102. It's a letter of the 7th of December 1984 to you. And I just wanted to it's headed batch dedication, and I'll come later to the question of batch dedication. But I just wondered if you could help us understand the second paragraph. Any moves directed towards restricting donor pool size, brackets designated plasma pool for each donor, must be discussed by all directors before implementation. It's an exciting option, but I suspect will have colossal cost and operational implications. There's much to be done before we need to consider this option. Do you know what Dr. Cash was referring to there?
Well, yes, I do. I didn't remember this letter until it was provided to me by the inquiry, and it was a response to a suggestion by Dr. Crawford for a system of restricting or creating individual donor pools. And I have to say that I never really understood at the time what he was actually proposing. But it did seem to me, and it certainly seemed to Professor Cash at the time, that it might have been horrendously expensive and operationally extremely complex. So he was simply saying we have arrangements in place to control donor pool size. What was the date of this?
December 84.
December 84. By then we had agreed to introduce a system of batch dedication to control patient exposure to donors, and this, however exciting, was extremely complicated and should not. And Professor Cash's view, and I think probably mine as well, was that it was not really a viable option.
Is it right to understand it received no further consideration?
Oh, absolutely
in any
none.
event?
No. Well, that's not fair. There was no further discussion on this as an option.
Freeze-dried cryoprecipitate. We know from documentation that the inquiry's already looked at, and indeed oral evidence that the inquiry's heard. A little of what happened in relation to the freeze-dried cryoprecipitate production at the Law Hospital.
Yes.
I think you've seen in the materials provided to you documents that suggest it's something that Mr. Watt certainly was not keen on, describing it as a step back in history and a suitable product perhaps for Turkey but not Scotland.
Yes.
I think were his words.
Yes, they were.
And I think you'll also have seen some exchanges between Mr. Watt and Dr. Cash on it. As I understand the chronology, it was essentially abandoned in January 1983. Did you have any involvement in the decision-making relating to the use of freeze-dried cryo?
I don't recall having any detailed discussions about. I think it's by 1982 I would have been aware of this, but perhaps primarily from a historical perspective. I think by the time I arrived at PFC, I think as far as I was concerned, the discussion and debate about this was all but over. There was still the option, and it hadn't been formally abandoned as an option, but for all the reasons that have been provided, freeze-dried precipitate was, I think, formally put to bed, as it were, in early 1983.
Well,
in addition, I think my view at the time was that such an activity would have required a complete redesign of the manufacturing facilities. It was a completely different process. It was small pool, multiple small pool manufacture. We didn't have the environments in which to do that, the sterile handling environments and so on. So, and at that time, I was in the middle of a process of redesigning a facility for large-scale manufacture. So my view would have been, this can't be done.
At the PFC? At
the PFC, from a quality perspective.
But you didn't have any involvement in the question of whether it could or should be done elsewhere?
No.
Can I then come to the stockpile or surplus that was built up? I want to look at a handful of contemporaneous documents with you in a moment. But how was it that by the end of 1983 into 1984, the PFC had built up this significant quantity of product?
I think it was a consequence of increased throughput, plus, and probably more importantly, the rewards from the work that Dr. Foster did in terms of increasing process yield for factor 8 at that time. And I think, and I can remember discovering that we had this large quantity of factor 8 and doing some simple calculations and concluding that unless we took some action, then this product would outdate. And I communicated that to Mr. Watt, and Mr. Watt subsequently communicated it to Professor Cash.
And what I want to do is just look at a couple of those communications from 83 and then look at a couple of communications in 84 with BPL, and then just explore it a little more generally with you. So if we start by looking at PRSE 0001576, this is a memo from you to Mr. Watt and others, 18th of November 1983. It says a recent survey of the stock levels of factor 8 concentrate both at RTCs and within the PFC sausage machine indicates the development of some important and interesting trends, which I feel should be examined as a matter of urgency by the SNBTS so that appropriate action, if any, can be taken. And then you refer to the stock levels here. I think, need to read out that second paragraph. And then looking at the third paragraph, you say, looking back at the SNBTS annual statistics for 1982-83, the SNBTS issued approximately 25,000 vials of factor 8. Assuming this rate of usage is maintained, present stocks represent 1.4 years' supply. If this stockpile continues to grow at the present rate, i.e. 10,000 vials per year, then we will soon be in a position of manufacturing factor 8, which will inevitably outdate. And then you conclude, however, I have a feeling that we may already be in a position where other existing material or future batches will outdate. And then you suggest trying to gain a more accurate picture of where we are holding. So we can see that you, Mr. Grant, have done some form of stock exercise.
Yes, I can't remember whether it was initiated by Mr. Grant or maybe just in terms of my routine sort of surveillance of the centre. I noticed that we had very, very large quantities of factor 8 and perhaps asked Mr. Grant, who was the manufacturing manager, to do a stock take and find out some details of what product existed, what its expiry dates were, and so on. And I remember being quite shocked at the outcome that we had accumulated that amount of material whilst still operating a pro rata distribution system. But we may come on to that.
Your concern was that you were going to have more than you needed to issue, and you were essentially going to be left with outdated concentrate that couldn't be used.
It's not so much. It's not. Well, yes, in a sense, but the concern that I and certainly Professor Cash had and others was that this was valuable material. The UK was short of factor 8, certainly NHS factor 8, and it would have been a shocking waste of material if this was not usefully used for haemophilia care in the UK. So it was the waste of product in terms of haemophilia care that was shocking. In a sense, having a surplus product in itself is not a problem. You can destroy it, but that would have been a criminal act, I think.
And then if we go to PRSE 0001537, this is Dr. Cash to Mr. Watt, 29th of November 1983, copied to you or referred to you as well, as we see from the stamp. If we just look at the first paragraph to start with, recent correspondence with colleagues at PFC and odd comments gleaned from others has indicated that we may be genuinely moving near to a national SHS surplus of factor 8. SHS, is that Scottish Health Service?
Scottish Health Service, yes.
It would be imprudent to make any rash moves at the moment. We will take the opportunity of examining the position together in the near future. 2 points I wish to make at this time. And then the first, outdating. It would be a very serious matter if product outdated when patients south of the border continue to be exposed to commercial material. So that's the point I think you were just making.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I have a gut reaction, but we need this corroborated by PFC, that supplies may be sufficient for us to pull out RTC deposited product that has 6 months shelf life left and offer it to the NBTS. And then he asks Mr. Watt to provide him with certain information. And then we go over the page, just so that we don't need to come back to this document. We can see there the second point is batch issue to individual patients. I've long dreamt that this might eventually be introduced even gradually to reduce the number of donor exposures. I'd be most grateful for your thoughts on how this could be introduced in your region, and then the PS, an answer to A is more urgently required than B. So we'll come back to the issue of batch issue or batch dedication.
Sure. This letter was, I think, almost certainly sent to regional directors as well, because he's asking them for data on the amount of product that they had in their centres.
So that's end of November 1983, the existence of this surplus or stockpile appears to have been clearly identified, a little work being done to ascertain exactly what was held and,
yes.
and to consider options to deal with it. We then move, I think, in terms of the documents I'm going to ask you to look at, and then I'm going to see if you can help fill the gap, to June 1984, CBLA 0001850. And now, of course, that was the document we just looked at was 29th of November 1983. Mr. Watt left soon after in December 1983.
Yes.
You took over in beginning of 84 as acting director, and this is sent by you in your capacity as acting director to Mr. Pettit at BPL, 8th of June. If we go to the text of the letter, I understand that agreement has been reached between Dr. Cash and Dr. Lane that excess stocks of PFC factor 8 are to be decanted to CBLA for subsequent distribution to regional transfusion centres in England and Wales. Dr. Lane's indicated you're the most appropriate person to liaise with PFC. Next paragraph, you'll appreciate that a regular supply commitment cannot be made, but our best estimate is that a total of 7 to 9 times 10 to the power of 6 international units, I think that says, could be decanted to England and Wales within the current financial year.
It's 7 to 9 million, isn't it?
It's 7 to 9 million units, yes. Yeah.
I'm now most anxious to establish the necessary arrangements for product supply. And then you continue by saying you'll supply the product in our standard package. I suggest a quarterly collection would be the most practicable arrangement. Perhaps you could let me know when you'll be in a position to receive and distribute this material. No doubt you will contact me if you require any further information from this end. Our interest in the material, once it's been sent to CBLA, will be restricted to arrangements for product recall in the event of a product defect / adverse reaction. In such an event, I believe it would be most sensible if you acted on our behalf. So that's you writing to BPL 8th of June 84. And then if we go to CBLA 0001882, this is a further letter from you, 7th of September 1984, to Mr. Pettit. And it says, following our telephone conversation, I can now confirm that 2,123,500 is AIU.
The A is a typographical error.
Thank you. So units of international units of factor 8 concentrate will be delivered to your centre on the 14th of September, and you explain it's equivalent to 8,320 vials. And then the next paragraph, it's difficult at this stage to assess how much will be available in the next quarter, December 1984, and then you give an estimate of what the surplus may be, but say that you shouldn't plan on this being available. Now, having looked at that correspondence, can you help us understand, first of all, why, if on the basis of this correspondence, it looks like it took until the middle of 1984 for the arrangement to be made to supply surplus to BPL?
Yes.
Do you know why that couldn't have taken place more quickly?
No, I think there was one parallel activity that was going on at the time, at the beginning of 1984, when I took over as acting director from Mr. Watt, and that was the dismantling of the pro rata system and putting in its place a supply arrangement based on clinical need, on a truly national distribution system, irrespective of the amount of plasma that was coming. And that decision was proposed and agreed by directors on the basis of the stocks that have been built up. So I think I'm trying to reconstruct what might have happened, which will have caused this. I wouldn't call it a delay. Why we didn't actually formalise the arrangement until June, and that was we were waiting to see what impact that arrangement would have on stock levels and so on, or maybe it was no more complex than wanting to reconfigure our supply arrangement in Scotland and then move on to this as a separate topic. I don't think we perceived it as an urgent activity.
And then,
Well, but just on that last point, the letter from John Cash of the 29th of November 1983, where he spoke about the need to reduce it and asked for an answer to 2 points, point A and point B. He said, in effect, that point B can wait, but point A can't, and point A was this.
Yes.
So, if it wasn't urgency, it must have been next best thing.
I think it was. Professor Cash was making the point that it was urgent from an SMBTS perspective to establish exactly what the stock level was at the regional transfusion centres as well as the PFC. I don't think he was implying that there was an urgent requirement to decant the product,
I see.
other than its imminent outdating. He was simply saying we need to fix this problem first because we cannot be seen to be allowing Factor 8 to outdate on our shelves. That would be a shocking dereliction of duty, I think his view was, and I think I shared that view.
do you know what else was done with the surplus? Was this supply to BPL essentially the answer to the issue identified by Dr. Cash?
Well, it was envisaged at that stage to be an initial step. I think I was quite surprised when I reviewed this correspondence to see that I'd estimated 7 to 9 million units. That would have clearly been over a long period of time, and I think with hindsight it probably didn't take account properly of losses on heat treatment which were coming in and increased demand and so on. So it was probably a slightly exaggerated or at least over optimistic view of how much could be supplied to England and Wales.
Just on that point, in this letter that's currently on screen, the quarter in which 14th of September falls 2 billion, the quarter in which December falls 2 million, that's a rate of 8 million a year.
Yes, I don't think the intention was to do it on a continuous basis at 8 million a year. I think the surplus that had been built up had been built up over a number of, well, not a large number of years, but maybe 83 and 84. We had built this stockpile, and I think it was simply, I think in some ways it was demonstrating proof of principle that it was possible and appropriate to transfer products from one part of the NHS in Scotland to another part of the NHS in England and Wales. I don't think it was ever envisaged as an ongoing arrangement. It was a mutually agreed and satisfactory and I think appropriate thing to do in the circumstances, because product. I think this was quite unprecedented. I know that sounds quite surprising in today's world, but it was unprecedented at the time that product from Scotland should be transferred to England or vice versa. They were administratively quite separate units, and although there was, as we've said before, high degrees of cooperation, there was never large-scale transfer of product.
Was consideration given by you or by Dr. Cash or anyone else, to your knowledge, to providing some of the stockpile to Northern Ireland, given the relationship that already existed with Northern Ireland and the difficulties that Northern Ireland faced in terms of the effect of the pro rata system?
I don't know that I've got a clear memory or recollection of that. I don't recall there being discussions, but I think as I mentioned before lunch, I think that would have been an appropriate thing to do.
And then this letter envisaged that there may be a further supply in December 1984.
Yes.
Did that ever happen, or did that get overtaken by events?
That was overtaken by events.
And is it right to understand, and obviously we'll come on to this, but the surplus that was held by PFC was then effectively heat treated?
Yes.
To enable supply of the heat-treated product to patients in Scotland?
Correct, yes.
Can we just look, before we leave this topic, at a discussion in your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry? Sully, it should be PRSC 306025, please. If we go to page 28, I think it might be. Yes. So this is in the course of a series of questions and answers about the surplus and what was done with it. But I just wanted to ask you about the exchange here. So you refer towards the top of the page about the importance of finding out, this is lines 4 to 5, what the regional transfusion centre stock was, which is what I think you referred to a few minutes ago. And then there's a reference to the Glasgow figure. And if we just go further down the page, I think it's, there's a passage that I'm, oh yes, sorry, top of page 30, my apologies. Yes, you pick up on, in your answer in relation to the Glasgow figure, and you talk about, this is line 4 to 5, certainly the stock level in Glasgow was much higher than I thought it would have been. What can you recall anything about that now, the particular detail in relation to the level of stock held in, presumably, the Glasgow Regional Transfusion Centre?
We're really talking about 1980, mid-84 now, aren't we?
Yes.
Or certainly late 83 when
Yes.
we were carrying out this exercise. Yes, I think all of these observations and narratives actually contributed to my one of the first things I did when I became acting director, which was to dismantle the pro rata system and build in a system which was based on supplying regional transfusion centres with product based on their stock levels and their estimated clinical need, and built into that system from early 1984 was a requirement for regional transfusion centres to feed back on a monthly basis what their stock levels were, and then PFC could, as the central unit responsible for supplying products, would have a much better overview of the overall stock position in what I described earlier as a sausage machine.
Okay, we can take that down. Thank you, Sonny. I want to move next then to a topic of hepatitis, and specifically your knowledge of hepatitis and what was understood about hepatitis at the PFC. At the time you took up your role in 1981, what, if any, knowledge did you have of hepatitis?
Of hepatitis? Very little indeed. I think in my witness statement I described, I spent a very informative and interesting year working as a biochemist in the Royal Postgraduate Medical School in Hammersmith, in the chemical pathology unit, and I guess that's where I first came across hepatitis, because samples were supplied for analysis in yellow tubes, and when I asked what the yellow tubes meant, they said that's coming from a patient that is suspected of having hepatitis, and we were told to be very careful with it. That was probably the extent of the intervention that occurred. But beyond that, and from discussions with colleagues and doctors that worked in the unit in Hammersmith, I had some understanding of what sort of patients that material would come from. But beyond that, I had no knowledge of its pathology, its clinical sequelae to becoming infected with hepatitis, so it's very rudimentary understanding.
And then you said in your witness statement at this inquiry that you became aware of the association between hepatitis viruses and blood products within weeks of joining SNBTS. You describe it as a knowledge that was superficial initially, but deepening with time through discussion with PFC colleagues and wider SNBTS colleagues. So, going back to, I think, a question I asked you earlier, would it be right to understand that there was no formal training that you received about risks of viruses or hepatitis in particular?
No, I had no formal training. I think, without wishing to be too immodest, I think I learnt very quickly from the regular and detailed discussions and correspondence and meeting with doctors and visiting regional transfusion centres and so on. But it wasn't a formal, structured programme to educate me in issues associated with hepatitis.
And do you recall learning relatively quickly or otherwise about non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes, it was the first time I'd heard of such a thing when I joined the SNBTS. But as I say, again, within weeks, I was educated in what this actually meant at a very superficial level. You know, there's hepatitis B, which I was aware of, but I'd never heard of non-A, non-B hepatitis before I joined the blood service in Scotland. But as I say, from discussions with colleagues and basically the work of PFC and from Mr. Watt as well, I think my learning curve was quite steep in respect of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
And in terms of the nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis, do you recall what the prevailing view was in PFC that was being shared with you about the nature of it or the seriousness of it or its potential for long-term sequelae?
At the beginning of the 1980s?
Yes.
I think it probably reflected the wider perspective on non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was it wasn't properly understood. I think, to be honest, the view that was conveyed to me, or the view that I took away from discussions and conversations with colleagues, was that it was a mild self-limiting disease, undesirable. You wouldn't want to catch it, but it's not a major issue. That was at the beginning of the 1980s. Now, as we know, I think that particular view that I picked up developed quite quickly into a better recognition of what this disease caused and what its long-term sequelae was. But I learnt these. I got my perspective from discussing with colleagues in the SNBTS and attendance at, and particularly when I became acting director and I attended regional directors meetings, RTC or SNBTS directors meetings, the topic of non-A, non-B hepatitis was discussed frequently. So that was a useful and important learning experience as well.
Can I just ask you to look at one paragraph in your statement on this issue and see if you can help illuminate it a little further? It's WITN 6920001, please, Sally, page 31. 3 zeros. Paragraph 87 is you saying that you became aware of the association between hepatitis viruses, blood and blood products within weeks of joining SNBTS, and then you explain how that deepened through time with discussion, in particular following appointment as acting director. And then it's the next paragraph I wanted to ask you about. You say, also at this time, Professor Cash was increasingly expressing his view during informal discussions and conversations that manufacturers, including PFC, should begin to address the challenge of producing non-infective with respect to hepatitis products, and that a prevailing view amongst haemophilia care providers and the fractionation industry that risks of infectivity were greatly outweighed by the benefits of increased treatment would not be sustainable in the longer term. And two matters arising out of that paragraph, Dr. Perry. First of all, if we just have 87 and 88 on screen, please, Sally. Are you able to be more specific about what at this time refers to?
At this time, I think my earliest recollection of this type of conversation with Professor Cash was a lunchtime discussion. We often met at lunch because we went to lunch at the same time, and we spent the lunchtime discussing non-A, non-B hepatitis, and I think that would have been in probably in maybe late 1981 or 1982, and the view that was expressed to me by Professor Cash was that we really can't sustain a product supply which is transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis to all its recipients. He just saw that as it might be nowadays seen as a blinding glimpse of the obvious, but at that time he was simply saying that this is not sustainable, even measured against the perceived benefit of clotting factor concentrates in haemophilia care. He found that, I think, genuinely deeply uncomfortable, and that's why he created this the Factor VIII study group in 1982.
Did you understand Professor Cash to be articulating that view because it reflected a deeper understanding that non-A, non-B hepatitis was not this mild self-limiting condition?
I don't think it necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily infer that from his conversation. He was simply saying, we know that there is something contaminating the blood supply, and that is finding its way into coagulation factor concentrates. That in itself is a justifiable reason for taking action. I don't think he was either giving me or whether he'd concluded himself that non-A, non-B hepatitis was a much more serious condition than had once been thought. It was simply the fact that a pharmaceutical product that's injected into patients should not be infective for anything.
And then, just still sticking with the end of 1981, if we look at CBLA 0001464. These are the minutes of a meeting of the UK Haemophilia Centre directors, 9th of October 1981. And if we go to the third page, we can see that you're in attendance. You're the sixth name down or thereabouts, Dr. Perry.
Oh,
so
yes, yeah.
This would have been the first time, obviously, you attended a meeting of UK HCDO, because it's the first year of your employment at PFC.
Yes, I think this was part of my unstructured training programme. Although I think it said I was attending on behalf of Mr. Watt, but...
And if we just go to page 19, please, Sally. We can see there the heading Reports from Working Party Chairman, and the first report is in relation to hepatitis. Dr. Krask is presenting a report pre-circulated to all Haemophilia Centre directors, and then there's a discussion that's recorded in the minutes. Do you know whether the reports of the working parties were circulated to other attendees who were not haemophilia centre directors?
I don't think they were confidential documents. I think they enjoyed quite wide circulation, is my understanding. Does it provide a clue to that on the heading?
No, that's why I'm asking. It says it was pre-circulated to haemophilia centre directors. I'm just wondering whether you, as it were, able to go home from the meeting with copies of Dr. Krask's reports to share amongst colleagues in SMBTS or PFC?
Well, it might not have been a written report. It might have been a verbal report that he delivered, and but I have no memory that in the introduction to these meetings it was stated that they were confidential or anything like that. And indeed, on the occasions that I did attend these meetings, I would often write a report and circulate it to colleagues. It was part of the collegiate discussions that the transfusion services had with haemophilia directors. I don't think they would have served any purpose if they'd been confidential.
No, I wasn't suggesting that they were
okay.
confidential, Dr. Perry. It's really just a question as to whether you can recall whether... We know Dr. Krask did produce written reports. I was simply wondering whether they were made available beyond haemophilia centre directors.
Well, they would have been circulated if I had received such a report from Dr. Krask at the meeting. Then, as soon as I got back to Edinburgh, I would have circulated that to colleagues. It would have been photocopied and posted out.
And then, if we just move forward, perhaps before the break, to the second UK HCGO meeting that you would have attended. So PRSC 0000185, please, Sally. So this refers to the Haemophilia Directors Annual Meeting, 13th to the 14th of September 1982. Now, these are not the minutes. This is a note taken by someone in attendance. If we go to, I think it's probably page 3. So, is this your note, do you think?
I have seen this,
yes.
and I've tried to work out myself whether it could, in a sense, it could be. It sounds like it might have been written by me, but it might have been written by somebody like Chris Prowse, Dr. Chris Prowse, who was very familiar with coagulation factor products. It seems to have a fair amount of high-level scientific and clinical data in it for me at that stage in my career to have competently written this, but some of the phraseology does sound familiar to me.
In any event, whether it was written by you, it would appear from the very top of the page where it says notes on matters of relevance to PFC. It was written by someone associated with PFC for the purpose of sharing with PFC. Is that a fair
Absolutely,
inference?
yes, yeah. This would have been circulated throughout the SMBTS, I think.
And then I just want to ask you briefly about something at page 5. You can see, we don't need to look at the top of the page, but there's a discussion about liver disease in haemophiliacs. And then it's the bottom half of the page I just wanted to ask you about. So there's a reference to a presentation, it would appear, by Professor Zuckerman on non-A, non-B hepatitis, and then a presentation by Dr. Snape, which is described as containing no revelations, but then it says it was the declared policy of BPL in the future to establish a system whereby all incoming plasma would be quarantined for 6 months in order to enable reports of post-transfusion hepatitis from centres to be traced to plasma donations or pools. Do you know whether a similar system was or policy operated at PFC?
No, we didn't operate that policy.
And do you know whether any consideration was given to whether it one that should be adopted on receipt of this?
I don't know. This was 1982, wasn't it?
Yes, September 82.
If we had done that, that would have required the express consent and approval and support of Mr. Watt and Professor Cash to do that, and removing effectively 6 months' supply of plasma would have severely affected our ability to maintain our output and so on. I'm not absolutely sure whether BPL did actually implement this. because there would have been the same downside for BPL to it's basically post-transfusion surveillance.
And then if we see there's a reference there to a policy in relation to infrequent users of factor 8 and 9, and then over the page in relation to regular users. I just wanted to ask you about the first of those. We can see the second, selective vaccination, the third, heat inactivation, currently being investigated. The first refers to improvements in donor screening and pool security. Do you know what's meant by that?
No. No. What is the? Can we go back a page, please?
Yep. So it's
Is
the
that,
bottom of the previous page.
or is that just the heading in
Yes.
removal of viral contaminants? Is that?
What's this? It is a note of Dr.
Okay.
Snape
Yes.
presenting BPL policy in
Okay.
relation to infrequent users, and then
Okay.
over the page regular users.
Yes. Okay.
And it's just the reference to obviously donor screening is, I think,
Improvements in
evident
donor
what that
screening
is.
and pool
Pool
security.
security.
I'm not quite sure I can
Don't
explain what that means. Selective vaccination is fairly obvious. That's perhaps injecting susceptible haemophilia patients with hepatitis B vaccine, because that was the only vaccine that was available for hepatitis viruses at the time, and heat inactivation. But no, I can't. Unless Dr. Snape was suggesting that you could do some more to reduce the viral burden in plasma pools by changes to donor screening, and I'm not sure what pool security meant, but.
And then just before we leave this topic and break, if we can go back to your witness statement at WITN 6920001, page 33, please.
I would say, having just read that last document, that I'm fairly confident that it was written by myself now.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a prolonged debate during your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry as to whether it was or wasn't.
Okay,
So,
okay.
one mystery solved, hopefully. And then if we just look at paragraphs 94 and 95. 94, you say this: in any event, it became clear to me at an early stage in my employment in SMBTS that the transmission of non-A, non-B to, e.g. haemophilia patients was an unacceptable state of affairs. Thus, the decision to establish an SMBTS Factor 8 study group. That's picking up upon the concern expressed by Professor Cash, essentially.
Yes, it's part of that.
And then I just wanted to ask you about 95. You say, notably, in the early 1980s, research was conducted in SMBTS with the objective of identifying specific candidate markers and tests for non-A, non-B hepatitis. What particular research did you have in mind there?
It wasn't being undertaken at PFC, it was being undertaken in Dr. Brian McClellan's centre by, and I do remember his name was Bob Hopkins, and his project was, he spent a considerable amount of time, I think measured in years, in searching for appropriate markers that you could measure that would be indicative of non-A, non-B hepatitis infection. I think despite his best efforts, and he was a very good scientist, I don't think it had a successful outcome, but it was a process in place in SMBTS.
Sir, I note the time, and I'm moving to a different topic, so perhaps a good moment for the break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now, but yes, till 10 to 4.
Thank you, sir.